So I'll go through some slides, and then feel free to, if you have questions of clarification at the outset, feel free. And I guess I'll try to get through about 20 slides or so, and then after that, I'm happy for a much more free-flowing conversation. So yeah, who am I? Well, that's basically what Rick was just talking about. I did work at Microsoft for a while, and both in Microsoft Office and Microsoft MSN Search. I mean, I was in product groups. I wasn't in research. As a matter of fact, my manager said, I wouldn't tell people that you have a PhD. Because then, the fear was that I would be dismissed as somebody who didn't know what I was doing. What's the project? This is a project at the University of Washington in the Information School, keeping found things found. And the logic is finding is a well-studied problem. Not that we have all the answers, but it's been the subject of a lot of research over the past 20, 30 years. And keeping things found is not so well-studied, but it happens all the time. It happens with everyday objects. And it certainly happens with information. And keeping things found is an essential aspect of personal information management, or PIM. So I like to ask audiences what I call the Google questions. And so I've always wanted to be able to do that at Google, and here I am. So here are the Google questions, and we've done this in studies. We've also done it in presentations. And it goes like this. Why do you have folders? You don't have to answer this part. But most people, when you say, well, why do you have folders, like file folders? Well, to get back to stuff again, make sure that I can get back to it again. And then we say, what is your favorite web search service? Well, not surprisingly, almost everybody says Google. And do you like it? Yeah, I like it a lot. Okay, so then we say, suppose, and we started asking this even before there was Google on the desktop, so we modified it as that came out. Suppose you could access your information in the same way. So that you could just with a couple of keywords, you could get back to anything you wanted, quickly, easily, effectively, safely, securely, and you can stipulate additional conditions, okay? And then here's where you get the answer. Now, can we take away your file folders? What do you think? And also your email folders, all your folders. Who says yes? Okay, so you're not that much different from an ordinary audience, or a non-Google audience, I should say. I don't know how many people there are here. I counted about 3 people who said yes, maybe 4, okay, if you're the 4th. So that's, in general, it's about 1 out of every 20 people. So maybe it's slightly higher here. We'll have to get I'm not going to try to count the number of people here. But and most people say no with some emotion to it. So for those who didn't say yes, why not? Why can't we take away your folders? Yeah? You don't what? Okay. So if you had better support for keywords, you might be able to go, willing to go. Even then, why not? Okay.
If I have to attach keywords to say it's important today, why would I put that in trouble?
So it's just easier to drag and drop it into a folder. Okay. But,
search isn't perfect.
Pardon me?
Search isn't perfect. So
search is not perfect, yeah.
I'll never be able to get some parts.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and there's a certain unpredictability about it, at least the ordering of things that come back. It may be far down the list. Yeah?
I think it helps with recall. You remember the different things that you could be looking for, like your school versus your work versus whatever you said. It just reminds you.
So yes, it's a reminder of things. The folders themselves, and now we're getting into something else, that the folders themselves have information value. They're not just a means to an end, i.e. getting back to information. They are information in their own right. I think you and then you, I think, had, yeah.
A lot of times the metadata isn't good enough to be able to break down the space. Like I want to know all of my bills organized by date, and right now the search interfaces can't usually return a good set of results for that.
Well, so it's the search or it's the lack of metadata associated with the information?
Well, if the metadata were there, I think search would be better.
Okay, all right. But now I did allow you to sort of stipulate that. I didn't say Google desktop search as it exists today. I said, use your imagination. But the essential action would always stay the same. It would be basically the essential action as in searching on the web would be type in a couple of words. Most people type in about 2 words, I guess, and well, that's how you get personal information. Yeah.
Sometimes the information you're searching for is extrinsic to the document. These are albums I like. The liking isn't intrinsic to the document.
Right.
I
So
actually search for something.
Yeah.
If the property I'm searching for is not encoded.
okay. So there's personal stuff that just you would never expect that the authors of the document or the providers of the music would tag. They couldn't.
These 10 go together. These
Yeah.
are a list of 10 things that go together in my mind.
Sure.
There's nothing other than that.
Yeah.
Other than that links them.
Yeah. Or this is the song that I remember when I first met my spouse or my.
Not individual things. It's
Oh.
groups of things.
Okay, grouping. Okay, grouping. That's another thing. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
I find also folders have a hierarchy, where labels don't have a hierarchy.
Okay.
School and then fourth year, third year, stuff like that.
Right. Okay. Now hierarchies are a lot of people hate hierarchies, so it's also sort of good to think, well, why is a hierarchy maybe sometimes useful? Because there's a lot of, if you read the literature, for example, Dorish and Edwards talk about hierarchies as something terribly constraining. You can, but we can come back to that later. Who else? Did anybody else have anything else they wanted? We probably shouldn't spend too much time on this. Yeah.
Labels and tags have a many-to-many relationship. Things you're tagging.
Yeah.
And also can have something can have no label and no tag, so there's no hook. Whereas folders have a one-to-many relationship. So the item you want is in one folder, not 0, not more than 1. So you know where to look. It's always there, never somewhere else.
Okay, and I'm kind of, if I paraphrase that a little bit, it sounds like maybe that limitation, which, again, Dorish and Edwards would say that's a horrible limitation, but in some cases you're saying that makes things more manageable somehow, or that it's more predictable. You know that it has to be there. Okay. I just, hearing somebody else's cell phone made me remember that I should probably mute mine. Okay, so I wanted to tell you what people said, what people have said, and it's basically a paraphrase of some of the things you've said. Folders for control, that comes back to, I think, your point about, it's a grouping, and you want that grouping. Now, at some point, we can sort of start to stipulate tags as hierarchically organized, and at some point, the differences really go away. But along the way, we learn something about why we don't want to give up our folders just yet. Folders as a representation or a proxy for information. So one person said, we've done studies of this as well. Folders help me see my information better. And that's an interesting one. And folders help me see what I need to do. I think we had that over lunch, that there have been analyses, for example, by Ulla Belter of folders as being inefficiently used because they don't have any information in them. But in real life, we use folders as a placeholder, not for things that are there to be organized, but for things that we want to acquire as a reminder of things. And moreover, there's research in psychology, cognitive psychology, that says there's sort of this notion of opportunistic use of information. If you have a plan articulated, you're better able to identify information and recognize it. Even if you're not thinking about the plan, the fact that you've gone through that makes it better. You're more effective at opportunistically using information that comes your way. One thing I think is really good, putting things into folders helps me to understand and remember the information better. Is that true for anybody? Yeah, so a few people. So that's sort of an interesting thing, and we'll come back to that. It's like the folders are an externalization, maybe, of some categorization scheme, and so they actually, the act of putting things in the folders makes you attend to those properties, maybe, that are represented by the folder, and that are also true of the properties. I want to show you an example. This is from somebody who was having a traditional Thai wedding. And she'd been planning it over the course of 6 months. And here you have, and we've reformatted it, and I've taken out a few folders that were a little too personal to leave up there. But you get the idea. Look at this. There's a wedding, a project folder, a wedding, and under that are components of the wedding. And the folder hierarchy, in a real sense, stands for a partial problem decomposition. These are the things I need to do at the wedding. And some of those even have, they sort of are like sub-projects of the wedding project. So, you have things like cake. Well, got to decide what the cake is going to be. Where there is wedding presentation, there's also wedding dress. And then under that is wedding dress trials. So now, not everybody has this level of detail in their folder representations, but that's obviously, now let's look at this. What does that say? First of all, it's if it were a project plan, somebody from, say, Microsoft Project would say, oh, this is hopelessly confusing. I mean, I can't tell what's been done and what hasn't been done, and that's right, although, a lot of people would say Microsoft Project is hopelessly confusing too. In the other direction, it forces too much on you. But here we have kind of this mixture of things, and she, by looking at it, and she sort of talked about how she used it, she could sort of say, oh yeah, the cake, I've already done that, so that's done. But in the same look, and as she's looking at that, she's also looking down here and saying hotels. I've got to decide about the hotel, or I've got to decide about where the ceremony is going to be, or where the reception is going to be. So it's a reminder of things to be done and a record of things that have been done, all sort of mixed together. And the nice thing, of course, is that the information is all grouped there. She used it mostly for files, but occasionally she would drag in a pointer to a web reference, too. I think she even drug in some email messages. There's a lot here that I won't go into, a lot of things. I sort of say that in group, you could also imagine this at a collaborative setting. So in this example, she could show this to her mother, and her mother might say, well, have you thought about seating arrangement? Now, the fact that she hasn't, or maybe hasn't, is not visible when she's talking to her mother, but it's quite visible here. It's not represented up there. And those of us who've been at a traditional wedding know how important it is that you get that seating arrangement right, or people won't be speaking to you for years after that, if they feel like they've been slighted. So at any rate, there's a lot here. Now, this was an earlier version in a slightly different format. It shows you what it's sort of started. That was like before and after. This is the before, at the beginning of closer to the beginning of the 6-month period of planning. So you can see that that structure didn't sort of fall out of the sky. It emerged over time. Here's another example of somebody doing a house remodel. So you see things like house, and then insulation, plumbing, short platting. Now, I presented this last year in the spring, just about a year ago, in Eindhoven, Holland. And one of the people there said, well, I'm going to use Google on the desktop. And actually, let me go back here. I'm going to use Google on the desktop, and I don't really believe that you need folders anymore. And he was really quite skeptical of all of this. Folders. I'm going to use Google on the desktop. And so I said, well, okay, I'd like to get in touch with you later and see how things went. And so I did. I contacted him by email and asked him how things were. And I said, well, are you ready to give up your folders? And he said, well, yes, but if I use folders, it's for task management, not for filing so much. And furthermore, I'm not deleting my folders yet because I bundle the documents together. So he's basically saying some of the things you were saying. So I didn't say, I told you so, but I might have said that. So what? Well, one so what in the context of this audience, I think, is rules on the desktop for my information, for personal information, are different than on the web. And once we truly understand the rules for personal information, we may finally be in the position to reinvent the desktop. We've heard that over and over again for the last 20 years, almost from the time the virtual desktop came out. People are saying, we've got to reinvent the desktop, but it's basically, I can't tell a huge difference. I don't know if any of you can. Well, if we understand what people are trying to do with their information, we might be in a position to do that. Now, I'm sort of, this is the way, one of the ways we sort of look at personal information management on the KFDF project, and as a mapping. And sort of the effort to establish, use, and maintain a mapping between information and need. So we have our finding activities. They're kind of going from need to information. I need to get somebody's phone number because I want to call them, so I go to an address book, or I look on my cell phone these days and find it. Or I need to remind Bob of a meeting, so you know, I send an email message and then I need to find his, yeah.
Just a question of semantics. When you refer to the desktop, you're referring to the metaphor through which we're looking at a top of a desk metaphor on a screen, not the way we interact with the desktop computer, right?
Yeah.
Desktop, you mean?
Well, I'm using the term loosely. Yeah, it's sort of like there's my area and my, you know, the desktop is kind of a nice way of referring to that, but it's obviously, you know, we're never going to get to a new metaphor if we have to keep on labeling it the desktop. But people, you know, when you read things out there, it's like reinventing the desktop, you know, or reinventing the desktop metaphor. So at any rate, finding goes from need to information. And then there's keeping, which goes in the other direction. And again, I don't think that's, you know, one of the things we believe is that hasn't been getting its fair attention. And that happens all the time. I say, here's my business card. Well, you've got a keeping decision. You know, what are you going to do with it? Maybe you're going to, you know, politely look at it and throw it away as soon as I leave because you don't have any reason that you can possibly imagine for getting back in touch with me. Or maybe you decide, yes, I want to contact him again, but I have other ways of doing it. Or maybe you still use those other ways, but you still keep the card as a reminder. Those are all sort of keeping decisions. What are you going to do? Is the information useful? An email message, do I answer it now or later? That's sort of a keeping decision. If I answer it later, how can I be sure of getting back to it again? Do I put a flag on it? Highlighting is kind of a keeping activity. I read an article and I highlight parts of it because those are really important. And I want to make sure that when I go back to it later, I attend to those parts that I've highlighted. And then there's what I call meta-level activities, and these have more to do with the mapping itself. And sometimes I just call them M-level because in English, so many of the operant activities or labels for them start with M. So we have maintaining and organizing, managing privacy and security and the distribution of information. And the key thing there is that you know, if we just wanted privacy, we'd just bottle up all of our information and we'd go off and live in Montana somewhere and you know, never talk to anybody again. But obviously, there's the flip side of protection of our information is projection of our information, and through that our needs and wants to the world, and we want certain people to have our medical information. So it's a two-sided coin. And then measuring and evaluating, how are things working? How do we know? I mean, how do we know whether we're making effective use of our email? And then the last one is, well, some people say sense-making, but manipulating, making sense of, and using the information. And then I jokingly say mañana, because a lot of these things are things that we never have to do, and they're easy to postpone. And if you sort of go back to the original, of course, meta has come to mean about or above, but the original was after. So you can also sort of say these are afterthoughts. And keeping and finding, that they demand your attention. You have a need, you have to do something about it. But there aren't that many events in a typical day that speak for meta-level activities. And so a quote from your article, Brick. I like this. Some of the comments that relate to that are stuff goes into the computer and doesn't come out. It just builds up. And you talk about sort of the self-auditing effect. And we have the same thing. We would ask people to show us through their information, and if they didn't try to tidy up before we arrived, if we came back the next time, we would definitely see evidence that they had reorganize things. And it wasn't just to please us. It was also because they said, you know, when we were talking last time, it did make me think about my information, and I decided enough is enough. I'm really going to get reorganized about this. So you wonder, well, what was prompting them to do it? If there weren't an earnest researcher there in their office looking at their information, what would have done it for them? Maybe nothing. There aren't events to speak for these activities, the way there are events to speak for finding activities or keeping activities. Does this make sense, or is this? Okay. So some questions just to think about. Does organization matter? Well, maybe not. There's, I don't know if any of you, I along with Jamie Teven and Ben Peterson, I edited a special issue of Communications of the ACM, and one of the articles in there was Search to Eliminate Personal Information Management. And then in the article, they weren't that, they said, well, we're really talking about organizing information. And I think for a lot of people, organizing information sort of is kind of like cleaning up your room. You know, remember when you were a kid and your parents said, clean up your room, you can't go out and play. I think that organizing information has about that level of appeal to people. But if you say, what if you say representation? Well, certainly representation matters. There are a lot of studies that say that. Sometimes the differences, and the mappings aren't perfect, but sometimes the differences are 16-to-1 in performance, depending on the representation of a problem. So what's the difference between representation and organization? So that's something to think about. Another thing is, does organizing matter? That's different from organization. We might say, well, the computer can do that, and do I have to do any of that? Well, you don't ask, if you have a house cleaner or a maid, you don't ask them to organize. You probably don't trust them to do some of that. You do it yourself. But the other thing that there is evidence that some level of manipulation is important. We have to get our hands on it, at least figuratively. And so I'm going to give the example I gave over lunch. There's sort of, back in the 60s, they had cake mixes that they developed them, and they could be just add water and bake it. And in market tests, homemakers said, didn't like it, because it didn't feel like theirs. And so they redid it, so they took out the egg ingredient, so they had to crack an egg and put it in. And that somehow or other made it theirs, made it something that they had done. Now, I don't think it's quite that trivial. I think there's more there than just sort of, I think people have to manipulate their information to some degree. So the question is, how much? Anybody recognize this? It's not that easy to see, but I'm not sure if the resolution were better and it were larger, I'm not sure you would recognize it. Okay. No guesses? Okay, actually, even if you knew, I would say don't say anything because you'd give it away. What about this? What? Okay. Periodic table, that's right. It's an early version. It's the first published version back in 1869, I think, or maybe it's 1896. I can't remember now. I think it's 1869. And this was from Mendeleev's field notes. And of course, we know it today as this. Now, that's a very powerful representation. I think some of us learned to hate it when we were in chemistry class. But the interesting thing about that today is that it's not only a representation, it's also a way of organizing the information. So, and that's brought through quite clearly. If you go out to the internet now, like here are some pointers to, it's a way, it's an entry point. If you click on one of those elements, you get a whole lot of extra information about that element. And you get it through this representation. So the organization is information in its own right, but it also provides access. So it's both. So again, we're back to this. A good representation maybe emerges over time. Okay, well, the current focus of the KFTF project is we're looking at personal information collections. They're increasingly digital, increasingly important, and increasingly increasing. And there's also, you could sort of say that there are, we define them in a way that says there are islands of relative calm in the midst of a sea of personal information. So you have a lot of things that are maybe nominally under your control, but there are certain parts of that you choose to make yours. So, you know, you get a whole lot of email, for example, or there's a lot that you don't know where these icons came to on your desktop, but there's some part that you sort of decide is yours, and you try to make it yours. So what is that? And we're sort of at, why do people do that? What do they try to do? And how can we help them do it better? And then we're also focused, related as a personal project activity. There are a lot of those, either work-related and non-work-related. So plan a summer vacation, finish a work review. And these happen over time and across forms of information. So that makes them nice for the study of PIM, personal information management, because one of the problems with a lot of traditional studies is they tend to sort of focus on one form of information, like email or the web. But all of us, when we're doing things, we have to use lots of different forms of information. So we need units of analysis that will sort of fully engage these multiple forms of information across multiple tools. I'll just give a real brief history. We've been around since 2001, NSF-funded project, and we sort of roughly 3 different major studies looking at how people keep information, how people refine, and how people organize information. So one study is kind of summarized in this. It's actually a series of studies, a series of observations. We looked at how people keep web information. And we have lots of different methods over here. And we were continually surprised at the number of methods people use. We expected them to use bookmarks, for example, for keeping web information, or favorites. But we saw a lot of other things that people were doing. And we originally weren't going to observe, we were going to just have 10 observations, but we ended up with 24 because we kept on seeing new patterns with every person. So email to self, email to others, print out, save as file, paste URL in a document, personal website, search, direct entry, bookmarks, history. Some people even wrote URLs on stickies and put them by their computer. And we did a little bit of a functional analysis to look at why people have this diversity of methods, and it turned out that each method realized a different combination of functions that they valued. For example, email to self had high on reminding, because it would show up in your inbox, whereas people frequently complained that bookmarks, they would make them and forget about them. And maybe they'd run across it later when they were doing a spring cleaning of their bookmarks or their favorites and say, oh, I wish I'd remembered that because that would have been perfect for a project that is no longer active. So this is just a summary of that. One thing here is that even though we set out to just look at web information, we ended up having to look at other forms of information because a lot of these methods involve a conversion from one form of information to another. So email, you paste the web reference into email and you send it as an email message. It's no longer, it's a URL embedded, or printing it out. It becomes sort of a paper form of the information. And then we did a series of refinding studies, and I guess one thing we found, we were surprised that we did basically a delayed queued recall test, and we were surprised at how good people were at getting back to web information. And I can go into the details later. I think we won't have time, but we thought, well, 95% is pretty good, even for stuff that's very infrequently used and people didn't even rate as that important. And people liked do-nothing methods over favorites and bookmarks. But then we started thinking about it, well, 95% maybe isn't so good because people in real life, they need to retrieve oftentimes a set of items, not just one item. And for something as simple as, somebody invites you to dinner next Wednesday, can you go? Well, you're not just going to go to your electronic calendar. You're probably also going to say, well, let's see, when is that performance I was thinking about going to? Maybe you go to the web. Maybe you look through email messages with an agreement that isn't recorded in your calendar. Maybe you look at a paper flyer. For something simple like that, you are going to multiple sources. And so failure can result from failing to retrieve just one of those. And so if you have, what did I say? Yeah, if you have to retrieve a set of 5 commitments, for example, a set of 5 different items in order to make a decision, the likelihood of success goes down to 77% to retrieve the whole thing. And it could be even worse than that. There's a lot of psychological research on output interference, and that if you retrieve, and partial list queuing, that sort of says if you retrieve part of a set of items, it becomes that much harder to retrieve the rest of them. because the act of retrieving strengthens the first two. And the other thing is that our study did the hard part. It reminded people to look. And in real life, that's one of the biggest challenges, is remembering to look in the first place. Well, then we're on to the organization, because the organization itself, a folder structure, for example, does serve as some of these. It serves to group things together so that you don't have to go in separate places. It serves as a reminder. And so we said, how do people organize? And can people do it now without, or what do people do now without or in spite of current tool support? And we have sort of a pictures tell a story. So, well, what's the story here? The story here is that people would really like to order these folders, and there's not much good support for it now. So leading characters is the way they force the ordering. For how many people do that? Lots of people. And why do you do it? Pardon? Well, but why do you care about ordering? It's, directing attention would be one of them, or prioritizing. So that's one thing. There's another example of that. People learn that certain characters are funny, and you'd also see the other direction. Instead of moving things up, people put a ZZ at the beginning of something to force it to the bottom of the list. Obviously, with something like this, it doesn't work so well if you discover, oh, actually, I want 2.5 in there. It doesn't work. Here's another one. Some people, now this is not true for everybody, but some people try to reuse folder structure. You see down here, this is from a student. And this is basically a template. It has subfolders for things like assignments and readings. How many people do this? Okay, 3 or 4 people. And what we did in one study, we found that 40 plus, I think 42% of people did this in some form or another, not necessarily creating a template like here that they could copy and paste, but they would at least go back and look at a past folder organization to get an idea of how they should order for this current project that they were doing. So, and that's true of professors. It's true of us if we're planning a trip somewhere. If we're going to one conference, we might look at the folder structure we did for another conference, because a lot of the things are similar. You've got to do plane reservation, hotel reservation, advanced registration, all of that. Here's another one. There's a tension between organizing for current use and repeated reuse. So we have, for example, current use. This is from a professor's snapshot of his organization of things. We have images and readings. And then also for course 541, so that also sort of says that there's some repetition in structure. But beyond that, he also has images over here. And that's kind of that's more of a flat structure, where the same thing with articles. Instead of readings, he has that. And there, in the articles, for example, they're encoded in a particular way, so that they all start with the first author's name, and then the year, and then the first part of the title. So what is he doing there? He's sort of trying to organize by properties for things that are being reused. So there's sort of this notion, well, there are a lot of interesting things there, but one is that we kind of would like to do both. And maybe in the context of the current use, the organization fits more comfortably into a hierarchy, but for organization for reuse, where you sort of are combining it with other things sort of like it, then maybe you're more interested in properties. So recipes, for example, or articles or photographs. Well, and then we also learned from looking at what people do. Again, in your study, Rick, you saw people doing ad hoc tidying during the experiment or during the study, and we saw the same thing. We had, in one study, 14 out of 14 people said, as we asked them to take us on sort of guided tours of the way they organize their information, email messages and files and even paper, they would say, oh, this shouldn't be here. 14 out of 14 people said, oh, this really shouldn't be here. And there was a little bit of guilt, or almost sort of the way you would feel if you were showing people through your messy house. Guess that it's stopped by unexpectedly. And so there's some information in there too. And we actually, in our study, we actually had 3 out of 14 actually insist on interrupting the interview so that they could move something out of the way or delete it. I'll just sort of briefly, we've had this project planner that we've been working on. It's part of a larger prototyping effort called the Universal Labeler. And it's a very basic prototype. But basically the idea is, one of the reasons we think people don't like organizing stuff is that it really takes you out of what you're doing with the information. So it's like if you think about folders or you're being asked to sort of step out of what you're doing with the information. So we thought, suppose we supported kind of an outline or rich text view of your information as just an alternative to the file folder view. And the idea would be that this would just be another view, but in this view you could more actively plan. So you could actually start to use your information. And you wouldn't be necessarily thinking about what folder it should go into. You'd be thinking about, well, I'm doing a remodel, so in the kitchen I need to think about countertops, and I need to think about overall layout, and media room. So headings are folders. They're basically, the ideal is that they're the same. I can show you a demo after the talk. It's, we have parts of it implemented, but not the total seamless with the file system yet. Ordering, people can order. In this view, they can order. And basically what we do is we realize this by, it is a view into your, we basically realize the ordering by putting XML fragments, one per folder, distributing them through, and then reassembling them into a coherent view. Drag and link, so you can drag an excerpt of a web page or an email message or a document, and either to represent, sort of summarize the information item or to remind you of what the information item is about. In context creation, we think that's an especially useful feature. Now this is fairly crude, so you can't even see that that's an email message, but it is. Quick question about budget for, I can't quite read what that is, but for countertops, I guess. And so, I mean, there are a lot of times when I think we send an email message to somebody and we say, did they ever get back to us? Or if they did get back to us, what do they say? And what we're forced to do, even if we CC it to ourselves, that doesn't necessarily help because it's just in this fairly more or less flat list of email. Or we go to the sent mail file. Well, here we have it in context. And say, well, let's see now. Now I'm thinking about countertops, and I remember sending that email. Did they ever get back to me? Now we have it in context. It's a much easier way to locate it. Informal notes. And basically the idea is one organization, many uses. And I guess another ideal here is that the organization emerges as sort of a byproduct of your efforts to plan the project. So, and that's probably the key thing there, is that the idea is that that you work with your information and the organization emerges as a consequence of doing that. I think I'm going to sort of throw it open. These are just a summary of the features, a little bit too wordy right now. So our next steps in prototyping are more views, look at more views, like a mind mapper view, for example. And we know that there are commercial companies out there that can do this a lot better than we can. So our purpose is just exploratory prototyping, see what works and what doesn't. And then auto in-place archival, we're looking at that. There's sort of a notion that maybe items, it gets back to this idea that stuff is around on your desktop and you never, or in your folder system, and you never bother to delete it because you don't have time. So maybe that can just happen as a product of disuse. It's still there, it's still in place where it is, but it sort of gradually fades away. And this is not a new idea. Malone proposed something like that a long time ago. Paste structure is a way to reuse structure. Downloadable life organizers. So see, these are all things that we'd like to do as next steps in prototyping. On the fieldwork side, we'd like to better understand how people manage their personal information collections. And also, we would really like to explore some measures for effectiveness with respect to three key activities: keeping, refining, and maintaining. And then understanding better the life cycle of personal information. How do things flow into and out of personal information collections? I think that's enough for now. And you can contact me at this first email, or you can go to the Keeping Found Things Found website. It's out of date, but it's still there, and you can find it just by searching for Keeping Found Things Found in Google. Any questions? I know this is a little bit too much for But I always have this. Yeah.
I'm curious, you kind of showed people organizing things in an ordered or unordered hierarchy. I was wondering, and the other alternative that comes up is tags. I was wondering if there was other things in that space, because they seem quite a long way away from each other.
Tags or hierarchy?
Yeah,
I mean,
and I was
or
wondering if there was other things that
gradations between those.
Or you know, other things that people have explored, other ways of organizing information.
Yeah, well, I think there are. Yeah, what? Oh, yes, repeat the question. So the question was, I talked about, I think we talked about tags versus hierarchy. And are there other ways of viewing your information or organizing your information that are also worth exploring? And the answer is yes, I think there are, and there are also lots of different variations on that. If you have properties, for example, what about a tabular view of that? And we do have something implemented in a basic way called the table view, for example, that basically takes two levels of your file hierarchy and it presents it to you in table form. And if you create a new column, it just sort of forces new subfolders in all of those. Yeah?
As I guess you were talking about people using folders for grouping like items together. Has there been any work on kind of collapsing the distinction between a file and a directory so that every file can kind of have links related? Maybe you can have a hyperlink network.
So the question was, what about collapsing files and folders or files and directories. So and of course that's kind of a variation of the hypertext dream, right? That there's not that at every step of the way you have something that both you can read for its own right, and it also organizes your access to what follows. And so that's again not a new idea. The planner does some of that. I mean, another way of looking at the planner is that you go back to Vannevar Bush, for example, and he talked about whole new trails of information sort of emerging as a consequence just of your using the information. I'm not sure that we want to just do a recording of the trails, but this is sort of somewhere in between. It says, as you're planning your project, some structure there can be used for other things besides just representing the plan. It can also be used to organize associated information. Yeah. And then you. Yeah.
When I look at things like Flickr and Delicious, they're very successful. But I often wonder whether normal people, like my father, really get into that sort of meta activity of tagging stuff for others to view. I know that savvy people have this in mind, but do you have any insider data to show basically how much time normal people are really put into that sort of optional meta activity of really tagging stuff?
I don't. I think it's a really good question. So the question is, Flickr and Delicious are popular with a certain group of people, but we know that's not representative of the broader population. And you were mentioning your father. Would he use that? And what data is there that relates to that? And I would ask you. I mean, Gmail is another example of the tag approach. So presumably you guys have done your own studies on that here, how people relate to that as an alternative to folders. And so if you have any experience on that, I'm going to. But the other thing but I think it's a really important area, and we've never had the time to do it. But there's like one interesting experiment would be just to have everything else the same and just work with two different metaphors. One is their metaphor, which is more like the folder, putting something into a folder, and the other is the labeler. Label this. And you could have the identical functionality, but just invoking a different metaphor. And does that make a difference? I mean, people also use labelers to label things. So how do they relate to those two? And what does that engage in us? I think that'd be interesting for somebody to do, or maybe it's been done. I think I had you, and then I think over here, and then you. Yeah.
I'm just trying to also.
No, well, did you have your hand up? You had your hand up enough.
Kind of put your thoughts together, and I'm feeling at a couple of levels. I mean, one discussion was just about files, the whole method of organizing or lack of organizing.
Yeah.
I got that. Then it's almost like you talk about tree structure or you talk about leaves, and at one level, then you jump to talk about emails and websites and snippets. And
Yeah.
it almost sounds like you've got two different things to talk about here: the way you're organizing and the things that you organize.
Things that you organize, yes. Yeah.
And so I was getting with you on the file structure, but it almost sounds like there's a whole issue of what are objects and how objects change over time.
Yes, you're absolutely right. So, and just to repeat that, there were at least two different talks in here, and one of them had to do with the structures. And this idea that, it goes back to this organization versus representation. Organization is sometimes talked about as something we don't like to have to do, but representation, we would say, is really important. So why not bring the two together? So that's sort of one talk in there. And then we can talk about how best to do that. Is that a tabular view? Is that a network view? Is that a tree view, a hierarchical view? And then the other one is, I think this was sort of implicit. I didn't make that explicit, is one of the major problems with personal information management today is information fragmentation, that we have kind of partly maybe as an accident of application development. We had files, and then we had folders to organize the files, and then we had email and folders there, and so basically all of us are maintaining multiple organizations and maybe multiple devices, so how do we bring that information back together? And I call those different forms of information. Is that what you're...
I have all those life organizers, I store files and emails and almost anything.
Yeah.
And I find that the most trivial thing is tripping me out, which is how do I drag an email into this thing?
Yeah.
As the window gets in the way. It's a real fundamental issue.
Well, and a lot of those well-meaning life organizers, they're meant to consolidate everything into one place, but they, in effect, give you yet another organization that you have to maintain, and you still have to maintain these others. And that's a legitimate complaint of, say, the project planner, too, although it's meant to be more seamless than that. I think, well, okay, you and then you.
Yes. So have you guys done much looking into archiving behavior? It seems like especially with media files like your photos or your music, you have this implicit idea of this is my collection or my corpus, but in many cases you may not have enough room on any one particular device to keep all of that, to keep all of your photos on your one computer. And so how do you avoid losing some of that data inevitably, or keeping it up to date in multiple places?
Well, no, we haven't looked at that. So the question there was archival issues, and that's one archival issue for those of us who have what's the standard capacity hard drive today? Well, it's bigger than that. I said, well, a lot of us have 80 gigabyte drives, and I was talking to people in the CSE department at UW, and one of them snorted and said, I have terabytes of data. So I don't know, but that might be an issue for some people. But there are other issues around archival, preservation of digital information over the long run, and will the formats that it's in still be supported, and the durability of the media for storing it. And those are big issues that we don't deal with those. Kathy Marshall has been getting interested in that, and there was a very popular New York Times article that came out a couple of years ago by Katie Hafner about the durability of digital information. Yeah.
So a couple of years ago at Triple Dup, there was a panel. So this is going with the web metaphor rather, or the web domain rather than the personal domain. There was a fun panel with three people from 3 different companies taking different views on the best way to organize information on the web. There was search versus hierarchies, taxonomies, versus that other great buzzword, facets.
Right, yeah.
No one's mentioned facets here. Does that metaphor translate to, or scale down to the desktop?
Oh yeah, I think almost any of those have, I mean, if you talk about property-based versus hierarchical, for example, that's that comes up in a lot of different guises. And actually, I have a slide on that that I just prepared. Coming soon to a desktop near you are issues that we think about in other contexts, like componentization in the context of software development. Well, a lot of us now are reusing pieces of old presentations or old talks, or even if we're in a company and we're not writing, we still have to write reports. So there's an issue of how do you divide things into components that can be reused, and people wouldn't necessarily talk about it that way. Another one is information integration. That gets back to this. We've got all this information fragmented. Controlled vocabularies. Well, I don't know. That a lot of issues that have had that have sort of come up in industrial strength situations may be coming up now for each of us as we now are talking about not just gigabytes of information, but maybe terabytes of information. And version control. Well, I thought version control would be mostly for people that write a lot, for example. You've seen the document that says final version. You know not to believe that. I mean, documents can't speak for themselves about whether they're the final version or not. But I talked to the CEO of GTE Finance, and he said, oh, that's a big problem for me, because he does lots of different presentations to different groups, and a lot of times the presentations are just slight modifications of each other, but it's very important that he gets the right version. I mean, it wouldn't do to have one person's client information on a presentation for another client. So he's facing that as an issue. So I think that sort of speaks to what you're, and did I remember to repeat the question? I don't remember if I did. Yeah. Who else had, oh, you did, okay, yeah.
My question probably is quite lofty, is whether or not we can use IRBs or facets for that, but just back to your earlier slides, you were showing, how you put stuff in and where it might go. And I was kind of curious about your designs around deletion, because it's unclear whether or not you're deleting a copy or just a link to the data.
Well, I have some thoughts on that. So the question was, what are concerning deletion? What are we deleting? Are we deleting the link or the actual or a copy or the original and all of its variations or whatever, so that it's forevermore? I have a position on that, but I don't know if it's the right one. And obviously, it wouldn't have worked for Martha Stewart, who I think tried to delete email messages only to realize that there were still copies around that could be subpoenaed. But and that's happened with lots of people. But so my thought is that for most of us, it doesn't matter anymore. Storage is dirt cheap, and what matters is your attention. And so I would say the appearance is what you want to delete. And so when I do these tutorials on PIM and talk about practical tips, one of the ones that people seem to always relate to pretty well is the advice, move, don't delete. Because deletion brings up, it's something Ofer Bergman calls the deletion paradox, or I call it the old magazine effect, that you really, if you look at something and you say, oh, can I do without this or not? It's like looking at an old magazine. Suddenly you say, oh, but there are so many articles in there that might be useful to me on a rainy day, and then you can't do it. So just move it out of the way so that it's not continually competing for your attention. And so I would say, you could keep the original, but just move the appearance of it, whether that's a copy or a link or whatever, move it away from your visual field so that you can populate that field with other things that are more relevant. Who else had, yeah?
David Tannenhouse at Intel used to put up a chart that said we're in the human-centered computing era. And it showed a person kind of managing, organizing all their devices and information. And his thesis was we have to get out of this era into kind of a proactive computing era where the devices are kind of servicing you, sort of. And
where the devices are what?
Are kind of doing some of the work for you automatically. And I know DARPA had a big project called Radar at CMU and SRI and other places to kind of help manage your calendar, your email, all your stuff for you. And I'm just wondering, is computer science, if we wait long enough, going to solve some of this, or should we really just try to be better organized or something? Is there any hope for computer science or AI to help with this more?
Let's see. Well, let me try to paraphrase, and you can tell me if I got that wrong or right. But I think one question there is, some of the issues I brought up, will they sort of go away as computers get better at doing things for us? And that's sort of related to this idea of, well, some people might call it ubiquitous computing, or that sort of they're more a part of the fabric of our everyday life, computers and their support. Will some of these things be taken care of for us that so we don't have to organize? Is that a fair expression? Okay. And I don't believe that's ever going to happen. I don't think that computers are ever going to do our thinking for us. And I think people are organized to think better. So, you know, there are parts of that the computer can take over, like, you know, notions of auto-archiving, for example. We don't ever take the time, we don't have the time to move things out of the way or do whatever, you know, so maybe it can sort of start to get smart about, based on our usage patterns, about fading things away. And, you know, they're still there, but they're not in view. But there are other things where you know, it's what makes us human, is to make creative new uses of the information and use it in new ways. And so I think that's always going to be there. I think maybe one last question, and then I think that'll be, probably should wrap up. Or maybe there aren't any last questions. Yeah.
So what's the conclusion? I mean, are we going to have folders forever, or when certain technology getting better?
Well, that's a good question.
We can get rid
Yeah.
of folders.
So the question is, what's the conclusion? I think are we going to have folders forever? No, I don't think so. Or I think they'll, what I think the conclusion is, before we talk about getting rid of folders, let's understand how people use them now. And the ways that, and a lot of the ways that I showed you were not anticipated by anybody when they designed the folder metaphor. It's kind of funny now, you know, Microsoft talks about their new release and they talk about virtual folders as search folders. And I think, virtual folders? You know, the folders that are there were originally virtual folders, but now we just sort of think of those as the real folders. Well, they were virtual when it came out. So I think that, you know, I think that we need to start thinking about what are people trying to do. And I think in the course of doing that, we're back to, I guess, the conclusion, which is sort of what I raised. The rules are, there are rules that people are playing by that are different from what people do on the web. And as we understand what people really need to do with their information, we can really start to change these metaphors in very profound ways, so that whether we call it a folder or not, it could be profoundly different from what we've got today out there. And I guess that is a good way to, that's a good point to say. Thank you.